Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have joined us today, and welcome to today's webinar, which is a discussion on evaluating democracy, rights, and governance programming lessons from the field. My name is Jack Farrell with the DME for Peace project, but I'm delighted today to hand over to Jessica Baumgartner-Zuzik, who will be today's Master of Ceremonies. Jessica, the floor is all yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Jack, and thank you to all the participants for joining us this morning. As Jack so kindly introduced, my name is Jessica Baumgartner-Zuzik, and I'm the Director for Learning and Evaluation and Alliance for Peace Building. And thank you so much for attending today's special webinar on evaluating democracy, human rights, and governance, or DRG programming. And we're going to be going through some key lessons to the field from both implementers, evaluators, and policymakers. This event is being co-hosted by the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium in partnership with DME for Peace, Eval Partners, and the International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation, or IOCE. The PEC is a consortium led by Alliance for Peace Building in partnership with CDA Collaborative Learning, Mercy Corps, and Search for Common Ground. So today's webinar is part of a wider consultation to support the peer-for-peer grant mechanism, which is one of Eval Partners' tools to support VOPEs across the Global South. We're going to be talking a lot about different DRG programming and how it encompasses quite a wide array of different program processes and a multitude of methods to evaluate and learn from these key programs. This panel is going to present evidence from the field on what this type of programming can look like, how implementers and professional evaluators have monitored and evaluated it, and how we can take this evidence and translate it into not only our policy work, but promoting effective evidence-based decision-making. I'm happy to turn over the introduction to Ziad Musa, who's the president of the International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and good morning, noon, afternoon, or evening to everyone, depending on where you are. First and foremost, very big thank you to everyone who joined forces in organizing this webinar, DME for Peace, the Alliance for Peace Building Evaluation, the consortium, everyone. We're absolutely delighted to be taking part. Just a little correction, I was the president of IOC up until 2017, and my brilliant colleague Adeline Sibanda is now the president of IOC, but I remain the co-chair of Eval Partners. Actually, IOCE is the umbrella organization that brings together the voluntary organizations for professional evaluation, or VOPEs, around the world. The IOCE, in partnership with United Nations Evaluation Group, as well as another array of partners, have established Eval Partners as a common umbrella for advancing evaluation practice, and more particularly national evaluation capacities and systems. This webinar truly reflects the spirit of Eval Partners, which is a broad partnership around evaluation, and where multiple perspectives from theoreticians, from the field, from commissionaires, from those who are actively involved, are brought together under one roof. The idea of calling this webinar started when we have launched a call of a peer-to-peer grant about democracy, rights, and governance with the support of the U.S. Department for State. When we received the application, first, the idea of the peer-to-peer is to have one or more VOPEs from two or more countries coming together and working jointly on a single theme. And this is the fifth round, and in this fifth round, the focus is on DRG. When we received the applications, we've noticed that some of the VOPEs are still struggling to put a DRG hat to their work. How can they marry DRG with their existing practices? Questions like, should we focus on use? Should we focus on methods? Should we focus on platforms? Should we focus on approaches? Should we focus thematically? Is it about migration? Is it about gender? Is it about equity? So all of these questions came together, and we were really happy to bring them on board to the consortium organizing this webinar. And we're absolutely grateful for the timely response, for the mobilization of such great specialists, and we really look forward hearing the rest of this webinar. In terms of users, we have some of the VOPEs who were granted a P2P project, but also attendance from other regions of the world where we couldn't find the suitable proposal. And I invite everyone to grab as much as you can from the presentations and from the discussions, and ask any question you have, because all the specialists are under one roof, and let the DRG Fund begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zia, and apologies on the title change. I would say congratulations to Adeline and yourself, but deepest apologies. Thank you for the informed information and the great start to this event. So I'd like to hand over the mic to Laura Adams, who is the Senior Learning Advisor for USAID's DCHA, DRG, and L programming. So Laura, go ahead and take us away.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, I work in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center at USAID. And I wanted to talk to our audience a little bit about very high-level measurement of democracy, human rights, and governance factors. And these are usually based on cross-national data sets. And I'm trying to figure out how to advance my slides. Let's see. Okay, great. So these are based on cross-national data sets, that is, data sets that measure a number of variables at the country level across time. And there are a couple of ways that we use these. Let me tell you about that first, and then we can get into what these things measure that will give you a concrete idea of what we're concerned about. And these are things that we want to look at, not in terms of any particular program and evaluating the impact of any particular program, but rather overall in this country, are we moving the needle in the right direction? Or maybe we're not moving it. Maybe we're just looking to see if the needle is moving at all for whatever the reasons. So using these large cross-national data sets is useful as a diagnostic tool for strategic planning. That is, where's the country going on these different variables? And this is important at USAID right now, because the new administrator, Mark Green, is emphasizing that our job should be to put ourselves out of business. That is, we should be helping countries along their own journeys to self-reliance, in his words. So we want to see where the countries are in this journey, and work with them to think about where they might want to go next. Cross-national data is also used for predictive modeling. So there's some very interesting research that's coming out using pretty sophisticated statistical techniques to look at the sequencing of DRG interventions. So on the right side of this slide, you can see a table where it's basically a predictive model to look at what kinds of changes in a country need to precede other changes in order for democracy in a very broad sense to progress. So, having elections, for example, and not buying votes are some things that need to precede things like judicial accountability, multi-party elections, having an ombudsman, for example. And then finally, we use increasingly are using these cross-national country-level metrics for descriptive analysis, to paint a picture of a country and to facilitate a discussion about where our resources should be going. These pictures that we paint are not like determinative, like, if a country is below this score, they need to have the programming directed there, but it's rather to give policymakers a better picture and more rich picture about where the country is going. So I'm just going to talk about one of the new data sets, relatively new in the last 4 years, that everyone should be aware of if they're going to be looking at big sort of longer term changes or country level data in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center to inform your evaluation work, or if you're working with strategic planning for a country, for example. So this is Varieties of Democracy, which is an independent research organization based in Sweden. They have a collection of data that has millions of variables. In other words, it's 180 countries. This is already out of date because they just released their 2017 data. It actually goes back to 1870 now. So from 1870 to 2017, there are more than 300 variables that measure both objective, that is, what the law says should be true, and expert-rated de facto variables. That is, what is the actual state of things? And they use a state-of-the-art methodology to reduce sources of rater bias and to make sure that scores are relatively comparable across time and across countries. So some examples of the V-Dem variables that we've been looking a lot at in USAID right now are the Liberal Democracy Index, which goes beyond just looking at elections. It does include elections, and that's a major component of it, but it also takes into account things like, to what extent does the judicial branch put constraints on the executive in reality? Does the legislative branch constrain the executive in reality? Is there freedom of association, freedom of expression, clean elections, and so on? Another V-Dem index that we're looking at that's very relevant to democracy, human rights, and governance work is the Diagonal Accountability Index, which rolls up a bunch of different variables related to media freedom, civil society, and citizen engagement in society, which is something that's very important to the democracy, human rights, and governance sector. And then finally, social group equality in respect to civil liberties is an attempt to measure marginalization of social groups, which is also a high priority of USAID at this time. So just let me show you just a couple of examples of the tools that you can use. V-Dem has these tools online where you can map out a country or a region and see over time to what extent has that country or region changed on whichever indicators you choose. So here's a little radar graph example for Southeast Asia on those three variables that I mentioned. Here is a breakdown of looking at particular countries and their change over time on the Diagonal Accountability Index. These are all things that you can generate within minutes online. And then here, just as a brief list of some of the other DRG sector metrics that the USAID has been really investigating in some detail. Worldwide Governance Index, the Legatum and Prosperity Index, the Safety and Security Index within that, for looking at sort of citizen security issues, looking at gender equality with the World Economic Forum, and open government policies with the World Justice Project. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a wonderful presentation to start us off on this whole variety of different panelists. I'd like to introduce our next group of panelists. It's going to be Hella Belakanji and Yusra Bakir, who are M&E program leads for the International Republican Institute for Morocco and Tunisia, along with Natalie Trucia, who's the Senior Manager for the Office of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning at IRI.
Excellent. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks so much for having all three of us here today. We're delighted to be here. We are going to take a little bit more of a specific look at kind of work that IRI does as an implementer, and also as we do many internal evaluations of our own work. So I think this will complement nicely from what Laura just presented at kind of a high level and looking at DRG work more broadly, even at a regional level. We're going to take a closer look and look at a couple specific country examples, Morocco and Tunisia. So I'll open us very quickly and then hand it over to Yusra, and then Yusra will hand it over to Hella, and then they'll turn it back to me so I can kind of close us out. So IRI is, as I mentioned, an implementing organization. We work with political parties, citizens, civil society organizations, elected officials at all levels of government to help build the infrastructure for democracy, democratic governance, and respect for human rights. This can look really, really different from country to country, depending on the current environment or the context or the needs in that situation. But some common examples of our program interventions include training political parties on effective campaign techniques or training on voter messaging, supports of political parties to create and sustain women's or youth wings or include women, youth, and other traditionally marginalized groups in political parties' internal decision-making and processes. It could be capacity building support for civil society organizations so they can more effectively advocate for their issues. Maybe it's facilitating opportunities for young people or women or ethnic minorities to engage with their elected officials and present their concerns or needs. Maybe it's mentoring or support for newly elected mayors or councilors or legislators or other government officials to better understand their roles and their responsibilities so they can serve their constituents better. By its nature, DRG work is complex, and often political situations evolve rapidly or unexpectedly, and this can make kind of identifying change, the kind of change that we hope to see, difficult to measure, and sometimes even difficult to identify. But we really think that, especially because of that complexity and those evolving contexts, that actually makes it all the more important to try to define some of those expected results. Often that's behavior change at the outset of a program, and to really try to identify that along with critical assumptions that really undergird our programs. So we're going to take a quick look at two specific program examples. Morocco is first, so I will turn it over to Hella. Excuse me, Yusra.
So in Morocco, our program, which was the USAID funded program, had three components. The first component was about strengthening the ability of women and youth to play meaningful roles in political parties, which we used to do through trainings, political party trainings, mainly internal management trainings, communication trainings, and prior to elections, campaign management training. The second component was about encouraging young people, since we have high political cynicism rate in Morocco. It was about encouraging them to engage in dialogues with each other about priorities in their communities, and also about think about potential solutions along with the politicians of their community. The third component was about providing civic education, and we did that by collaborating with civil society organizations and political parties, either through national civic education campaigns, using media, or pamphlets and other means in order to spread civic education. So so these were the three components of our USAID funded program. And now I'm going to talk about how we evaluated it at the end. It was a final evaluation that had as goal to assess the effectiveness of our program implementation, and it had also as goal to complement the answers to our initial evaluation plan. So we already have various indicators to measure the progress of our program implementation. We had indicators that were designed after we have projected the expected results during the period of program design. But throughout our grant implementation, there were elements that changed in the context, mainly political evolution context made that we didn't always reach the expected result, or maybe reach the other unexpected results. So we chose to, for this final evaluation, the most significant change approach in order to understand how the change happened and why some changes that we have projected didn't happen. So it was mainly why we chose it. It was mainly to go beyond numbers and focus on the human impact of our programs and empower participants to by involving them in data analysis, because our program beneficiaries we have had a relationship, ongoing relationship with them for 4 years, so it became also their program. So it was a way to empower them by involving them in its evaluation. We also chose this approach because it allows learning through evaluation, as it allows the program beneficiaries to synthesize their experience with the program and understand what are the main takeaways for them. Also, this process of learning is characterized by the fact that by identifying similarities and the differences in their stories of change, they can learn from each other's stories and think critically about the change that was produced. Yeah, so also this method is really valuable because it allows us to understand how the changes occurs and what are the processes and the causal mechanisms, and also when these changes happen, in what situations and context they happen. So I'm going to let Hala talk about her experience in evaluating Tunisia program.
Thank you. So, hi everyone, my name is Hala Blakanji. I'm the M&E specialist for Tunisia. So, between 2015 and 2017, IRI was implementing a program under MEPI. It was mostly on the improving communication within. It was working with the Tunisian government, and the objective was, one of the objectives was to improve the communication within the Tunisian ministries in order to come up with unified strategies that respond to Tunisian citizens. And the other objective was to promote interministerial efforts at the level of communication. So the objective was to have the ministries coordinate and communicate together in order to come up with like messages to the public. So the evaluation that I conducted, it was in 2016. It was from this program that we wanted to measure something different. So because of the changing political context in 2015 and 2016, There were 3 or 4 terrorist attacks in Tunisia, and there was also a major communication problem that caused a lot of protests. So we wanted to know how the Tunisian government is like developing their internal crisis communications since the first attack in Tunisia, and also we wanted to measure or know what impact, if any, IRI had in like the improvement or in the change of this like communication method. So what I did is that for my data collection, I chose I used a pre-existing scorecard in the program that served to me as the baseline assessment, and I created another scorecard for, it was kind of a midterm scorecard to see if there was any change since the program started. So I did some interviews with the ministries. It was mostly with the communication officials within the ministries. And I also did some media tracking to see how the external communication like changed or developed in that like time frame. So these are the 3 things that the scorecard, the interviews, and the media tracking that I used. And among the challenges that I encountered in like data collection is like mostly with the interviews, because there was a crisis at the level of government, so there was some problems getting in touch with the ministries, and so that's why I used the other like tool, which is the media tracking, which helped my evaluation. So that's it for me. So I turn over to Natalie.
Awesome. Thanks, Yusra. Thanks, Hela. Well, a couple of the, there are really 3 kind of main principles that IRI tries to follow in its approach to monitoring and evaluation for democracy, human rights, and governance programs. These are really based on our learnings and experiences globally, and informed by the fact that we are primarily an implementing organization, but one that takes monitoring and evaluation very seriously. And we do try to infuse evaluative thinking into all aspects of our implementation and throughout the entire project lifecycle, from kind of conception and design through implementation and then into closeout. What the first of those key principles is utilization. And this really stems from our belief that evaluation findings that are unused are evaluation findings wasted. And we might have discovered the most amazing or interesting finding in the world, but if no one is paying attention to it and no one is using it or can't use it, that maybe it wasn't the best use of our resources. So we really try to think about what is useful for beneficiaries or even the boundary partners in our projects, what's useful for implementers, ourselves to know, what's useful for the funder to know. And we really try to ask ourselves these questions first at the outset of any evaluation project to kind of guide that process to ensure that our final product is useful for someone. The second main principle that we try to follow in our approach is participation. Really trying to think about who will be involved and who should be involved, and what will that involvement look like. We believe that our beneficiaries and participants have really critically important insights that we as quasi-outsiders can miss, or worse yet, misinterpret. So it's really important that all of those folks have a seat at the table and a chance to contribute to the evaluation process. And understanding how our beneficiaries define and identify success or results is crucial to both capturing those results and understanding them in their context and informing our program decision making. As a bonus, which I think Yusra and Hella both talked about a little bit, this really tends to build buy-in, both for the evaluation process and the evaluation product, which really helps to reinforce some of the utilization of that we hope happens. Finally is adaptation, and this kind of has two meanings for us. First, it's, we believe monitoring and evaluation is really there to support the project and the project's implementation and design, not so much the other way around. So if the project needs to adapt or evolve to some kind of unplanned or unforeseen event, that's okay, and the M&E kind of plan and the evaluation plan might need to change as well. Those changes should be documented very clearly, very well, and those really should be looked at the end of the program to kind of understand what we may have missed in terms of our critical assumptions and what we could have planned for better next time around. The second part of that is that evaluations should help projects adapt. This kind of gets back to our first principle of utilization, but by providing that kind of information, that data to project designers and project implementers, they're better positioned to make those kinds of evidence-based decisions and design projects built on evidence, not just hunches or gut feelings. So we really do try to prioritize all three of those principles in all of our internal evaluations here at IRF. And that is all we have. I would encourage you all to think about those principles as you're designing evaluations and evaluation projects for this effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our colleagues joining us in the field and then also here. I'm happy to welcome our next presenter, Kira Bushko, who's joining us from New Rule, where she is the Senior Technical Director. So I'm going to share the screen here, so go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and it's a pleasure to be part of today's panel. As Jessica said, my name is Kira Bushko, and I'm Senior Technical Director at New Rule. We're a woman-owned small business providing democracy and governance technical assistance services all over the world, with a focus in particular on justice and security sectors. So today I'm going to speak with you a bit about results and our learning from two performance evaluations of a USAID-funded project in the DG space. I'll briefly describe the project we examined, explain a little bit about the evaluation process and how it played out in the Bangladeshi context, and then share some lessons we've learned about conducting evaluations for USAID in particular. First, a bit about New Rule. We were established in 2013, and though we're a relatively young organization, my partners and I have worked on rule of law, human rights, and DG issues in more than 40 countries over the last 25 years. In recent years, we focused work on access to justice, anti-corruption, and human rights issues, and we provide program design, implementation, and management, in addition to our impact and performance evaluation services. So we work with U.S. government, other bilateral and multilateral donors, as well as private sector clients. The Access to Justice, or A2J, project we evaluated in Bangladesh is USAID's Justice for All activity, or JFA, which is a program to strengthen and promote government-sponsored legal aid services for the poor and marginalized communities throughout Bangladesh. The National Center for State Courts is USAID's implementing partner, and Social Impact holds the indefinite quantity contract, which covers this and other evaluations for USAID Bangladesh. The project began in 2012, and closeout in all districts will be completed this year. I was a member of two different four-person evaluation teams that conducted the midterm and final performance evaluations. The JFA activity is structured around complementary objectives designed to support 3 of USAID's intermediate results for the Bangladesh mission's development objective on governance. So our evaluation focused on gathering evidence that would confirm or dispute that JFA achieved or made significant contributions to better legal aid services delivery, increased self-governance by the judiciary in serving the citizens of Bangladesh, as well as greater awareness by citizens of their legal rights. There were several key purposes of both the midterm and final evaluations. USAID requested that the evaluation team assess the technical and programmatic validity, as well as the effectiveness of the JFA activity. We were also asked to assess the implementer's performance in achieving actual results against the targeted results. And in addition, we assessed the short and long-term aspects of sustainability after 5 years of programming. USAID is particularly interested in evaluator input on possible mid-course modifications or project adjustments, or in the case of a final performance evaluation, recommendations for future programming. In our experience, these recommendations or lessons learned are the most important aspect of the evaluation report, and depending upon the mission, can have substantial influence not only on a particular project, but on DRG programming in general, and may even factor into country development strategies. For both the midterm and the final, we conducted the evaluation using a mixed methods approach, bringing quantitative and qualitative measures together for the analysis. Again, in our experience, DRG prefers a mixed method approach. Indeed, the nature of this programming pretty much demands it. In addition to document review, we developed protocols for key informant interviews, or KIIs, focus group discussions, FGDs, direct observation, as well as oral and written surveys. Between the 2 evaluations, we conducted over 140 KIs and FGDs and engaged nearly 500 stakeholders in the data collection process. In the Bangladeshi context, local evaluation professionals were key to customizing the tools and creating optimal conditions for effective collection of reliable data. For example, local evaluators can advise on scheduling, location, and any issues regarding the makeup of participant groups in FGDs, such as women only or interethnic or interreligious groups, in order to maximize participation. Local evaluators are essential, really, in developing questions that are culturally appropriate, phrased in ways that are understandable to respondents, and posed effectively to encourage honest answers. Here are some key lessons we learned during the 2 processes, the midterm and the final, from how we prepared for the evaluation, to what we did or did not do during data collection and analysis, to writing the report and our interactions with USAID along the way. First, be sure to do your homework. Planning and preparation is fundamental to a successful evaluation. This starts with thorough document review and includes work planning and meeting prep. Know who you're meeting with and why. Then be sure to prepare as a team. This work should not be a siloed activity. Involve all members in developing protocols. For example, review your project documents together. Build in time to discuss and analyze findings in a group. We did a better job of this during the final evaluation, and it really showed. Next, consult USAID or your other client early and often. A kickoff call helps set the tone and mutual expectations of the evaluation. Continue to check in and ask questions along the way, and they will definitely tell you what they need. Keep implementers involved or informed according to the particular aspect of the evaluation you're working on. Seek their input and advice in developing your list of interviewees while being sure to make final decisions about who to meet with and where to visit. Again, local evaluators can be key to setting expectations about the degree of involvement of implementers, and FGDs. DRG can also offer guidance. Take time to meet with the implementer staff in country and at headquarters as appropriate. Next, help interpreters perform their best. Providing background documents on the project is useful, as well as copies of the protocols for each interview or discussion. This can help them prepare and become familiar with the vocabulary and jargon unique to the sector and particular project. Debrief at the end of each day if possible. Midterm recommendations matter. For JFA, we developed 15 distinct recommendations and a series of lessons learned. The implementer was required to accept, partially accept, or reject our recommendations with justification for their decision. At the time of the final evaluation, USAID asked us to review and determine whether or not the midterm recommendations had been implemented. It's not a gotcha exercise. The evaluation process for USAID is an opportunity for learning and reflecting, and it provides a mechanism for accountability to stakeholders. After all, USAID has put millions of taxpayer dollars into these projects and has a vested interest in the success of each implementer. Evaluation reports should highlight project achievements as well as point out deficiencies, hopefully with specific recommendations for improvement. And speaking of specific recommendations, your recommendations should be as specific as possible and actionable. Your evaluation report will have a greater impact and influence if your recommendations are realistic in the country context and are directed at the right stakeholder or target audience who's in the best position to carry them out. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful segue into our next presenter, who is Daniel de Garcia, the Director of Performance Evaluation, Innovation, and Learning at Social Impact.
Great, thank you. So I work for Social Impact. I'm a Director of Performance Evaluation, Innovation, and Learning here. And one of the big things that I think I should open with is that we actually do not implement DRG programming. We really do focus on the analysis, the monitoring, evaluation, etc. of that information. So, it's not allowing. Okay. With that caveat, let me just kind of highlight some of I want to highlight one program in particular that shows some of the ways that we approach evaluating DRG programs. So this is with respect to a project that was a 5-year project in Liberia. This project was aimed at building both civil society and media capacity within the country. And what that meant in practice was that the implementing partners were working to help civil society organizations become financially sustainable, ensure they had really clear visions and mission statements, that they were able to pursue those visions and mission statements based on their human resource capacity, kind of internal understanding, that they were adequately representing constituents in the country. And then also they were kind of on a parallel track working to enhance media content. And in doing so, they were working to support, young journalists, to ensure that media content with, radio, television, newspapers were working on being objective, and that media organizations were able to deploy resources and report objectively, do fact-finding, things like that. And then between those two was connecting the civil society and media organizations to one another, so that media organizations had a link to some of the constituents and understanding what their desires and needs were. And similarly, that civil society had a venue to reach government, reach other constituents through media capacity. So with those in mind, within the Liberian context, a lot was occurring during this time period. So, there were elections occurring, and of course, as is common with DRG programming, the goals of the activity or implementation must often shift to adapt to that context. So, with some of the election turmoil, they began to have separate portions of the activity which were focused on how civil society and the media engage in elections monitoring and how to get people to vote and get people to understand, kind of see beyond political messaging to really develop their own thoughts with respect to what the issues were and what the candidates represented. Oops. So we, as I mentioned, do not do the implementation. We were responsible for monitoring and evaluation throughout this project. And what that meant in practice is that we certainly did the regular monitoring. So, we had surveys and, our performance monitoring and evaluation plan, and did focus groups and had, satisfaction questionnaires and things like that. But within DRG programming, as you move up the theory of change, what you often find is that things are a little bit more complex to measure than they might be in, say, an education or health program. And so in order to address some of these complexities, we really went at measurement through a really kind of multifaceted approach. So we used organizational capacity assessments. And what these are just measuring a variety of components, looking at financial capacity, mission and vision, reach, sustainability, kind of facets of that, financial management, things like that. And you can design and implement organizational capacity assessments in a number of ways. Given that this was a 5-year project and it was working in a complex environment, we took this opportunity to use participatory assessments where everybody in the organizations once a year would rate the organization themselves along these different components. And then we would facilitate a discussion about the ranges of scores and the average scores and who disagreed about the scores and why they were progressing or not along a certain trajectory within their capacity. Now, what this did was really allow the civil society organizations to believe what we were saying because the data came from them and we were just validating it. So they understood if they identified a gap in their organizational capacity, they recognized it as a need, which led to them really taking action on it and ownership of those recommendations moving forward. It also allowed them to be able to continue this process after we left. They had the tool in place, they understood how it worked, they believed in it, so they continued to use it long after the project ended. We also used media content analysis as a way to understand whether or not the intervention was having any impact, if the trends were changing with respect to specific media outlets. So we took samples of newspaper articles or radio programming and measured it along a number of categories. So this was both in terms of who was reporting, if they were having females report and that was appearing in their programming, but also did it show objectivity? Did they ensure they were looking for facts? Was it politically driven? And we were able to measure trends in media content over time. And in doing so, just the process of measurement also helped these institutions understand what it was that made for a good news story and really helped ensure that they were focusing on some of the key facets of media content. In addition, we did social network analysis in order to really understand the linkages between civil society and media organizations. We mapped out how they were collaborating with one another. What this did was allow us to understand who the key influencers were, who organizations trusted for information, who spread information, who believed they had the connections they needed. It also allowed us to understand who was left out of that network, who was not collaborating, either because they did not have capacity or because they were not trusted as a valid source. And finally, we also did most significant change, and this allowed us to more qualitatively capture some of the impacts that maybe weren't as intended. So the theory of change in democracy and governance programming, some of it varies. Some are kind of well-tested hypotheses, others are less so. And so we wanted to understand some of the unintended consequences, both positive and negative within that. The other thing I'll just mention that I think is very important for DRG programming when you're looking at evaluative efforts is to make sure you incorporate that context monitoring. So not just focusing on the theory of change and intended consequences, but how is the environment around you shifting? This, for example, really allowed us to understand that there were huge changes in the environment with respect to the elections in particular, and that therefore the programming, it triggered some re-examination of where the programming should focus within its civil society and media kind of avenues. So that context monitoring allowed us to respond to that, even though it wasn't originally an intentional part of the program. So what? I mean, we monitored, we evaluated. What does that look like now? So I think there's kind of three elements to this. One is that the data informed activity adaptations. This is kind of the lowest level change, but can be hugely impactful. So we were able to note that we should strengthen our work with a specific organization because they had a gap or they were doing well. We were able to say, this organization is now doing fantastic on their own. We can use them as a mentor for other organizations to build that kind of capacity, but also ensure sustainability and buy-in. It allowed us to shift focus to adequately adapt to the changing context. All of these were really crucial. Once the project ended, this information informed the design of new projects based on who we were working with and understanding the different contexts. It really helped this case was a number of different donors understand how should we work. Are there specific organizations that are well connected that we can then put our work through? What did we not understand about the theory of change? And there were a number of pieces of that they needed to re-examine and build into their design of future interventions. The last one is feeding into higher level policy decisions. This is one that as evaluators, we have a little bit less control over, but what we do is focus on kind of that utilization focused evaluation mentality and understanding who the users are. In this case, there were some kind of key strategic decisions being made on how to engage within the country, understanding the different elections monitoring and political context, as well as the civil society reach and capacity, allowed this donor to really be able to better inform their strategy on how to engage moving forward and how to invest their money. So with that, I'll leave it. I think feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like to talk further about any of these.
Thank you so much, Danny. Very informative and creative approaches to monitoring and evaluation. I think some key lessons that we all can take away from what you've presented. So to finish our not last but not least here, perhaps best for last, I'm not sure, but very excited to welcome Giovanni Dazzo, who's an evaluation specialist with the Department of State's Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, to give us a bit more information on, okay, so we have data, so what? Where do we go from here?
Well, thanks, Jessica, for the kind introduction, and to Eval Partners and to the IOCE. My name is Giovanni Dazzo, and I am an evaluation specialist within the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Before I get started, I'll provide a bit of background information about DRL's Office of Global Programs. DRL issues grants that support the department's policy priority of promoting democracy and human rights in every region of the world and across a number of thematic areas, including projects focusing on the documentation of human rights abuses, peace-building initiatives, rule of law and legal aid, and advocacy initiatives promoting the rights of marginalized communities such as youth, women, and ethnic minorities abroad. DRL manages the department's Human Rights and Democracy Fund, which was established by the US Congress in 1998. All foreign assistance granted through our office is done in coordination with US embassies and other Department of State bureaus, USAID, and intergovernmental organizations. We primarily provide grants to international and local non-governmental organizations. And our grants primarily emphasize the demand side of democracy and human rights, in that we ask implementing partners to focus on projects working directly with civil society and human rights groups, as well as marginalized communities and rights holders. As an overview, I'll cover a couple of questions, namely, how is evidence used and translated within our work at DRL to demystify the process of how decisions are made regarding funding, and how VOPEs can give value to the data that we're often looking for in order to promote effective evidence-based decision-making. Using these two questions, I'll show evaluators potential entry points on where data can be used by decision makers. Now, in April and May, our office begins our planning process for the next fiscal year. This process sets the foundation for the type of projects that we'll fund. During this time period, we, as the program office, receive papers from our policy counterparts. In these papers, policy offices articulate the types of democracy, human rights, and governance priorities that are being sought. Using these papers, program officers are then tasked with the responsibility of creating broad objectives that will be included in project solicitations, or what are often called requests for proposals. As a rule, DRL tries not to be too prescriptive in our program objectives, as we'd like to see creative or innovative approaches from applicants. After several rounds of discussion among various offices about program solicitations, these are formed and generally publicized from November to March, and applicants will then propose projects during this time period. In the last step of the process, DRL program officers, along with counterparts in USAID and other Department of State offices and other government agencies, will then go through the proposals sent by applicants to understand which approaches will most likely achieve the objectives that were sought in the solicitation. From this chain of events, you can start to see how program design processes often mirror that within a non-governmental organization, as our program officers also need to create objectives, question assumptions, and predict likely theories of change. All of these points, however, can be seen as entry points of where useful evidence could be infused within the planning process. However, we need to ensure our evidence is presented in a way that is relevant to all those in this chain. It's also necessary to understand that programs are not developed in a vacuum between our policy and program offices. Throughout the year, our decision makers meet with various human rights organizations and marginalized groups around the world, many of which happen during project site visits, conferences, meetings in Washington, D.C. and abroad. Once programs have started, though, we also use this communication to understand continued needs and programmatic progress. Program officers also review reports from a variety of sources, which are highlighted on the right hand of the slide. These sources can be seen as informal or formal information products, and all are used when we conduct quarterly grant reviews and annual data calls to detail positive and negative program outcomes and risks and challenges to successful implementation. Now, if you look at the top, I've listed communications with implementing partners and communities. But simply because this type of informal learning is only mentioned once, it doesn't mean that program officers place less of an emphasis on this than more formal learning products such as external research or DRL commissioned evaluation. On the contrary, ad hoc communications can often be more useful than for program decision makers because they see it as being more authentic and a relevant form of information, especially if they're able to meet directly with various communities that are in need of assistance. This says quite a bit on how many decision makers may see the utility and relevance of evaluation research, though. As evaluators, whether we sit within a government office, non-governmental organization, or are independent consultants, we constantly need to question, how can we influence decision-making to improve outcomes? This isn't necessarily from a political standpoint, but one that is rooted in the guiding principles of being an evaluator, in that we're often interested in ensuring that systematic inquiry is used to develop programming that meets actual needs and produces equitable outcomes. This begs the question of whether we as evaluators are unintentionally privileging the voice of researchers and considering it more legitimate than the voices of marginalized groups. What's often missing in DRG evaluation, much like evaluation for traditional development projects focused on health, education, or livelihoods, are the voices of marginalized groups and the voices of evaluators from those countries or communities. Since decision makers in our office or any office can't travel everywhere or meet with all communities, they should be able to trust information from evaluation research. However, if formal learning products are not seen as rigorous and authentic, they simply aren't used. We need to question whether we as evaluators can promote more democratic forms of evaluation as well as human rights-based approaches to evaluation so that evaluators can be the bridge between affected communities and decision makers. This can be operationalized in a number of ways, by including participants in evaluation design and the formulation of evaluation questions, or by checking that the findings and recommendations we write to see if they match those of the community. Evaluators can even showcase community voices through novel forms of data collection and reporting, such as participatory video, photo voice, or the most significant change approach. These forms can visually connect decision makers who may not have direct access to affected communities. Evaluators could also form partnerships with human rights groups. While evaluators can build the skills of these groups to use and value evidence, human rights groups can also add value to evaluators by showing them how to advocate effectively so data is used by decision makers. As the other presenters have mentioned, as we move through the theory of change for human rights projects, it tends to become more complex. However, we need to remember not to forget whether macro-level policies are actually benefiting communities. I'll finish with this last point and leave these questions on this slide. As evaluators, we need to consider whether we're fulfilling the usual research purposes of explanation, exploration, and description through systematic inquiry. But we often forget that useful evaluative evidence can influence policy. And if done alongside communities in a democratic and collaborative way, it's not only seen as more authentic, but it can also be an emancipatory process for those experiencing human rights abuses. Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters today. I know we've had a wealth of information shared with us across a variety of topics related to democracy, human rights, and governance, both monitoring, evaluation, programming, and use of data and for policymaking. So thank you so much, and thank you to eval partners and IOCE and DM&E for Peace for helping make this possible today. And thank you to all of our attendees who've joined with us. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions today, but this webinar has been recorded and will be shared, so you can reference both the materials presented as well as the information at later times. So thank you once again, and I wish everyone a wonderful day.